gone.
I used to think that too. Like, if you're the first person to do something, it's a big deal. But nowadays, no one fucking cares. Like, think of something you use every day. A sink. Who was the guy who invented the sink? I still haven't watched the NASCAR one. Oh, the Everest discrepancy is in Plymouth. Oh.
Always remember, if you ain't first, you're last.
Columbus, Washington, Armstrong.
Nice to reach up, Jay. Hope you're doing well.
These names are remembered for one reason.
Doing
and one
okay.
reason only. They were each the first to accomplish something remarkable.
So you can toss
The
it,
word
Jay.
first
Thanks to
is
Resub
one
Zero.
of the most
Hope you've been
frequently
doing
used
well.
adjectives in the English language. Out of all descriptive
Resub Vodka.
concepts, first may be the most important superlative. Words we use to express the highest degree of something. First is one of the most popular superlatives because it's so unambiguous. Being the first person to do anything is a big deal. All who follow you have no choice but to know your name. If you're the first to
Not true.
monumental, history will remember you long after you're gone.
I used to think that too. Like, if you're the first person to do something, it's a big deal. But nowadays, no one fucking cares. Like, think of something you use every day. A sink. Who was the guy who invented the sink? Fucking John Nobody? Like, only certain things is it cool to be first in.
Most superlatives end with the suffix est, a grammatical trait rather fittingly shared by the tallest mountain on the planet. Mount Everest is quite possibly the world's most famous landform. It towers nearly 9 kilometers above sea level and can be seen from over 300 kilometers away, equivalent to seeing New York City from Boston. It's a well-known fact that the first person to reach the summit of Everest was Sir Edmund Hillary in
I didn't know that.
1953. It's one of those pieces of trivia that gets thrown around so much that you just stop questioning it.
No, I never knew
Seems like
that.
something that should be indisputable. The first man to set foot atop the tallest mountain. An unambiguous statement of fact. Except,
Thanks, Resub Doodle Balls.
29 years before Edmund Hillary reached the top of Everest, there's a small chance, but a chance nonetheless, that someone else may have got there first.
Who was the first person to poop without peeing?
The Western world first laid eyes on
Another
Everest
great
in the middle of the
example.
19th
Thanks,
century.
man.
But it wasn't until 1921 when they first set foot on it. That year, the British Royal Geographic Society financed the first expedition to explore Everest and identify a route to the top. A leading member of the expedition was 34-year-old George Mallory, considered to be one of the most skilled climbers.
Hey, George.
Just 5 years prior, Mallory was fighting in the Battle of the Somme, where over the span of 5 months, the young men of Europe suffered more than 1.6 million casualties. In 1922, Mallory was about to enter one of the few places on Earth that was even more inhospitable. For millennia, civilizations around the world have considered the highest mountains to be sacred grounds. Anyone who dared to climb them would be trespassing in the realm of gods. No matter how superstitious you are, you can't deny that there are some places on Earth that human beings were never designed to go.
No, we can go anywhere.
Like Everest, the terrain
Fuck
is so
nature.
precarious that one misstep can result
Thanks
in
for the
a
5
fatal
gift subs,
fall.
Omelet. Appreciate
For most
it.
of the year,
Thank
the
you,
summit
Omelet.
is blasted with hurricane-force winds, enough to blow any climber clear off the mountain.
I did not know
Any
that.
practical attempts to reach the summit have to be conducted in roughly a 10-day window before the annual monsoon season, when wind speeds are relatively calm. Usually this window opens towards the end of May.
Thanks, Resub Makoto
Even
and
then,
Swamy.
temperatures at the top of Everest struggle to break 0 degrees, cold enough to cause frostbite on exposed skin in minutes. The frigid temperatures force climbers to seek shelter by nightfall.
Thanks to Resub Darth.
But even the welcome warmth of the sun presents its own challenges during the day. Ultraviolet radiation becomes much more potent at high altitudes. Combined with highly reflective snow, people on Everest are at constant risk of snow blindness and other debilitating eye
Jesus
problems.
Christ.
Even during optimal weather, conditions
I had no
can
idea.
change in an instant. Climbers can venture onto the Everest
Thanks
slopes
for
on a
Prime Earth,
clear
buddy.
day and suddenly find themselves stranded in blizzard conditions with nowhere to hide. As if that wasn't bad enough, the roving threat of an avalanche can wipe out an entire team of climbers in a matter of seconds. However, in spite of all the deadly hazards that await climbers at the top of Everest, the single most life-threatening factor has to do with what isn't there. At 29,000 feet, air pressure is 3 times lower than at sea level, meaning that climbers have access to only 1/3 as much oxygen. Mount Everest is one of 14 summits that extends above the 8,000-meter mark, otherwise known as the death zone. Beyond
That's hardcore.
altitude, the human body no longer has enough oxygen to sustain itself, and within several hours, vital systems will begin to shut down. Climbers who enter this range are no longer flirting with death. They are literally in the process of dying. If anyone in the death zone fails to descend back to a safe altitude in time, their chances of survival are 0. The death zone presents an extreme complication by making any run.
Seeing
towards the
pictures, it
Everest
doesn't
summit a
look that
crucially
crazy.
time-sensitive event. Climbers must maintain a certain pace on the final ascent or else risk running out of oxygen. To make matters even more difficult, the thin atmosphere makes the act of climbing painstakingly slow. Most climbers near the summit have to stop to catch their breath after each individual step.
That'd be pretty crazy,
The
Tori.
process is so exhaustive that summiters are expected to burn more than 15,000 calories, equivalent to the daily energy output of 7 people. The peak of Mount Everest is in contention for the single most hazardous place on the surface of the Earth. And 99 years ago, George Mallory was one of 6 climbers trying to get there. On
No
May
way he
19,
survived.
1922,
He's still up
Mallory
there.
led Howard Somerville, Edward Norton, and Henry Morshead on
Edward
the first
Norton?
official attempt to reach the Everest
Oh my
summit.
god.
Across 3 days, the team trekked up the north side of the mountain, eventually reaching a record altitude of 8,225 meters before
Thanks,
turning
Rebecca.
back. On May 24th, George Finch and Jeffrey Bruce set off on another attempt, this time making use of supplemental oxygen. On the 27th, Finch reached a new altitude record of 8,326 meters. Immediately, Mallory was eager to make his own attempt with oxygen,
Thanks, Resub Justin.
believing that it was his ticket to making history. While many of the exhausted climbers were hesitant to make a third attempt, Mallory's fascination with Everest had begun to turn into an obsession. On June 3rd, he
Imagine being
convinced
obsessed
several
with a
climbers
mountain.
to follow him on a hastily
Idiot.
improvised trek. Lapse in judgment. After the failure of 1922, he would have to wait 2 more years until his next chance to conquer Everest. In the spring of 1924, the British expedition crew were back in the Himalayas. Mallory, Bruce, Norton, and Somerville had returned from the previous mission, this time being joined by newcomers Noel Odell and Sandy Irvin. Mallory
Sandy!
was now 37, and reconciled that this expedition would likely be his last shot at reaching the world's highest
Thanks,
peak.
Resub Danny.
The May of 1924 featured historically poor weather conditions at Everest. Not wanting a repeat of the 1922 disaster, the group decided to overrule Mallory's original plan and attempt the summit without oxygen.
Why?
The change frustrated Mallory, who now viewed oxygen as a necessity to reach the summit. On June 1st, Mallory and Bruce began their journey up the North Ridge. After less than a day, the pair disappointingly aborted their attempt after
Ooh,
forced them to
not even 8,000 meters?
Second, Norton and Somerville began
Rookies.
their attempt, this time finding themselves in ideal weather as they marched higher up the mountain. By June 4th, the pair had made it all the way up to the Great Couloir before exhaustion and respiratory problems forced them to turn around.
Thanks, Resub Nolis in the
Edward
prime
Norton reached a
lazy.
new altitude record of 8,570 meters, just 280 meters
Man,
beneath
Hulk
the
is
summit.
crushing it.
Mallory was originally scheduled to make one last attempt
Thanks,
with
Resub Jimmy.
experienced climber Noel Odell, but after the failed first attempt, Mallory decided to call an audible. Instead of Odell, Mallory would make his final run to the summit alongside the 22-year-old novice Sandy Irvin, who happened to be the most skilled oxygen technician among the expedition crew. Based on this attribute, it's clear what Mallory had in mind. On June 6th, Mallory and Irvin began their ascent, each bringing with them
Thanks,
as
Tier
much
1 alley.
oxygen as they could afford to carry. The pair were trailed by Odell, who was taking photos about 1,000 meters farther down the slope. On the evening of the 7th, Mallory wrote a final correspondence to Odell before the run to the summit, saying to look out for he and Irvin near the summit skyline the next day. On the morning of June 8th, Odell eagerly waited for visual confirmation of the climbers. But Everest Peak for the moment was obscured by mist.
Oh, they
At
died.
12:50 p.m., there was a sudden break in the cloud cover, allowing Odell to clearly see the summit. There, Odell witnessed two black dots scaling one of the rock steps on the northeast ridge, with one
Thanks,
dot
Resub.
appearing
Oh, well.
to climb up and over the crest, just below the final summit pyramid. After 5 minutes, the mist rolled back in, and the two figures disappeared behind the clouds.
Thanks to Tier 1
This
Piss
small
Kinks.
fleeting moment would be the last time that George Mallory and Sandy Irvin were ever seen alive.
Oh, they did
Shortly
die. I
after the
figured.
sighting, a storm hit the mountain,
Yeah, that was a
and the two
wild
climbers
idea.
did not return from their attempt. Odell, as the closest party member, hiked up to around 8,200 meters to search for them. But after 24 hours, he signaled the rest of the crew that no trace could be found. Mallory and
They
Irvin
became
had been lost
Everest.
to the mountain. The tragedy would soon be overshadowed by the burning question looming in everyone's mind. The two climbers were on the cusp of the single greatest achievement in the history of human exploration, and no one in the world knew if they had made it.
I don't know about that. Yeah, FC, I know the channel, Wolfie. Thanks to resub Abor.
Welcome back, everyone, to a very special product placement. Today, the fine people at Bespoke Post have sponsored me on an
Bespoke Post.
expedition to become the first green man to climb the tallest mountain.
Thanks to Tier
in
1
Florida.
Turtle and resub
I'm
Mackie.
being joined by my Sherpa, Rusty Cage, and today, thanks to his help, we're going to be making history. Now, you've seen
I'll
your
let the
share
ad
of
ride.
subscription boxes, but I'm telling you, buddy, Bespoke Post is unlike anything you've ever seen before. Bespoke offers a variety of premium goods from under-the-radar brands. Many of their products come from small businesses based right here in the US. Whether you like
Yeah, it's like
cooking,
4 minutes,
fashion,
is
or the
it?
great outdoors, Bespoke has a box
Oh, you're
for
right.
you. And unlike other subscription boxes, at Bespoke, you only
Alright. Bespoke Post is
in
good
the
though.
1924 Everest expedition.
Sorry, Implement.
Reporters were eager to find out whether the highest peak in the
We've
world
got Arcane coming up pretty soon. I
as
gotta
the last people to
finish
see
the story.
Mallory and Irvin alive. The other members of the expedition found themselves
Thanks,
in a
Resub Cat.
frenzy of media attention. Fellow climbers Odell, Norton, and Somerville were under the consensus that the pair had reached the summit. However, the greater climbing community were far more skeptical, and future Everest expeditions would begin to raise major questions over the possibility
Thanks a bit,
of a
Sandu.
successful attempt. Based on the testimony from Norton and Odell, the working theory was that Mallory and Irvin were attempting to reach the summit via the crest of the northeast ridge, a route which at that point had never been explored. Climbers of the time lacked the knowledge or experience to truly
Yeah, they were
evaluate the
dumb,
difficulty of the
stupid,
route.
primitive
The
man.
major complication that Mallory and Irvin would have had to face was a geological feature on the ridge known as the second step. One
There's
of
the Resub
three
FCD.
prominent obstacles on
And
the
just
final
Bob.
run to the summit. At an altitude of 8,600 meters, the second step is a 40-meter tall near-vertical rock face that spans across the entire width of the ridge. Initially, it was claimed to be the rock step mentioned in Odell's eyewitness report, and was supposedly surmounted by one of the climbers in just 5 minutes. However, as future expeditions examined the second step, Odell's statement began to appear more and more dubious. The first climbers to definitively explore the second step arrived in the 1933 expedition.
Thanks to Prime Archie.
One member described
Bobby
the rock
Blue.
face as utterly impregnable. Edmund Hillary's successful summit attempt in 1953 did not have to navigate the second step, as he reached the summit from the south side of the mountain. The first party confirmed to successfully climb the second step was the 1960 Chinese expedition, which managed to overcome the obstacle using pitons, a climbing aid which Mallory and Irvin did not have. Even with superior tools, it still took the Chinese 5 excruciating hours to complete the climb. Future expeditions
Prime
would
Juno.
install a ladder to make surmounting the second step somewhat bearable.
Oh, thanks, Ali. Appreciate that.
Historical hindsight of the second step's extreme difficulty shed serious doubt on whether Mallory or Irvin
So Odell
could
killed
climb
them
back in 1924.
as a sacrifice to Everest.
Irvin, a novice climber, was almost certainly out of his depth. Only Mallory
Thanks,
would
Reese,
have
of
had a
impressionable.
realistic chance of navigating the obstacle, but many climbers today question whether even that would have been possible. Modern-day mountaineers now use tiered grading scales such as the Yosemite Decimal System to assess the technical difficulty of climbing features. In the century since the 1924 expedition,
Arcane is a
several legends
new
have
show on
successfully
Twitch.
climbed
Well, it's
the
on
second
Netflix,
step
but episode
and
1's
have
on Twitch and we're
appraised
gonna
the
watch it.
obstacle with grades
It's not
ranging from
sponsored or anything, I just want to see
5.6
it.
to 5.10.
Seems interesting.
Based on Mallory's climbing history,
Maybe
this
Prime
skill has
Thailand.
been estimated at a grade of 5.9, meaning that the second step may have been just within his capabilities. However, aside from his raw aptitude, Mallory would have also had to scale the step using rudimentary gear while hauling.
Just get a jetpack.
oxygen
Jesus Christ.
canisters, making an
like they didn't even try.
on an unexplored obstacle under all these circumstances.
Most
would have
interesting
required a
I've ever wanted to do?
superhuman effort.
Nothing. Fuck
and to
adventure.
do so in the 5 minutes that Odell supposedly saw, it would have to have been one of the most unlikely miracles in the history of mountain climbing. It's for this reason why many have inferred that Odell did not see the two climbers surmounting the second step, but rather the comparatively easier first step. However, if this was the case, it would have provided the pair with another major complication. At the time Odell spotted the climbers, they were already 4 hours behind schedule. If they were as far from the summit as the first step in that moment, they would not have had enough time to reach the peak by sundown. Even if Mallory and Irvin had continued climbing into dusk, their estimated supply of oxygen would have likely run out. An additional problem working against the two climbers was the rapidly deteriorating.
Some dude actually
weather
landed a
conditions over the
helicopter on
course of
Everest?
June 8th.
That is pretty cool.
Meteorological data gathered at the base camp during the expedition recorded a significant drop in barometric pressure between the 8th and 9th, which would have made the air near the summit even more thin. Everest climber Graham Hoyland extrapolated that on the day that Mallory and Irvin trekked to the summit, the drop in air pressure would have added the equivalent of 180 meters to the effective altitude of the mountain. Unfortunately, their summit day coincided with the arrival of that season's monsoon, and to get to the summit,
So they just got
climbers
fucked up
would
up
have had
there.
to survive the storm that hit the mountain
Jesus
at around
Christ.
2 p.m.
Poor guys.
A modern-day thermodynamic analysis of Mallory's clothing revealed that he would not have been insulated if the wind speed had risen by a significant degree, a scenario that he likely experienced in the June 8th storm. It's probable that this sudden change in the weather ultimately led to Mallory and Irvin perishing on the mountain, but for the moment, without any knowledge of their whereabouts, a specific cause of death could not be determined. Eventually,
They
though,
used
as
dead
more
people on
expeditions
Everest as
ventured up
progress
the slopes of
markers?
Everest, clues began to emerge
pretty
of
wild.
the fate of the two wayward climbers. In 1933, crew members discovered a lost ice pick just below the first step. The pick was eventually proven to belong to Sandy Irvin,
Sandy!
who likely dropped it near the scene of the climber's fatal accident. Now that an artifact from the missing climbers had been recovered,
Thanks, resub, Jimmy.
researchers of the mystery concluded that their final resting place couldn't have been far. Due to the extreme cold near the Everest summit, bodies stranded atop the mountain don't decompose, allowing them to essentially remain frozen in time. In 1975, Chinese
What?
climber Wang Hongbao reported
Holy
spotting
shit.
a body at an altitude of 8,100 meters. Judging by their clothes, the remains must have belonged to a climber from an old British expedition. 24 years later, several researchers organized a search to locate the deceased climber. It was on that expedition that Conrad Anker discovered a corpse about 300 meters beneath the site of the lost ice pick. Lying there, face down in the snow, was the body of George Mallory.
Oh!
Mallory's remains showed evidence of three
Damn.
key injuries. He suffered a broken leg, a puncture wound in the skull, and bruising from a rope around his waist. The bruising indicated that Mallory and Irvin were likely roped together when one of them
Thanks,
fell,
resub, Mike.
snapping the rope and separating the duo. Mallory's injuries were not severe enough to indicate a steep fall. He may have experienced a minor stumble at the ice axe location, after which he descended further down the slope where he suffered a second, fatal fall. Several of Mallory's possessions were recovered from the scene, which revealed additional clues to the summit question. His climbing goggles were found stowed away in a pocket, indicating that he was likely operating in low visibility. Mallory was probably descending after the sun had set or during storm conditions.
Oh, so he didn't make it?
One of his pockets concealed a note with a list of 5 oxygen cylinders, providing evidence that the climbers had brought one extra cylinder than previously thought. In fact, the same search mission
Didn't they make a
actually
book about this?
recovered
I
one
don't
of
know, man.
these
I don't read
cylinders,
books.
An artifact which
It's not The
marked
Outsiders,
highest
I don't know it.
confirmed
This
point
doesn't
that
seem like The
Mallory and Irvin
Outsiders.
reached. Rumored to be among Mallory's possessions was a photo of his wife which he planned to place at the summit.
Oh.
The photo was not found on Mallory's body, sparking further speculation to a successful attempt. But beyond speculation, no evidence could be found that conclusively proved
This
whether
is 5
he
gift
did
subs
or did
impressionable.
not reach the summit.
Thank you,
Many
impressionable.
researchers hoped that finding George Mallory would finally provide a solution to mountaineering's greatest mystery, but it may have only created more questions than answers. Today, nearly 100 years after the tragedy, climbing experts are still split on the fate of Mallory and Irvin. Seasoned veterans like Conrad Anker and Graham
Maybe they
Holt
faked their own death.
that they did not make it.
They made it to the
reasoning that
top
the
and then
duo
went with
simply had
aliens
too many
elsewhere.
factors working against them. Other researchers are more optimistic.
Thanks to 5 gift subs,
Philip
Lando,
Summers
and the
notes an
resub Nova.
inconsistency in the number of sleeping bags accounted for on the 1924 expedition, and suggests that Mallory and Irvin may have carried 2 of them on their summit attempt, possibly as a means of attempting a bivouac to buy them more time. Michael Tracy offers a solution to the second step problem by suggesting that the climbers bypassed the obstacle entirely by using the North Ridge Traverse, which was the standard route at the time. Tracy presents a comprehensive explanation for how
sweet.
the pair
Thanks,
could have
Stank.
followed this route while using a system of oxygen caching to reach the summit before sundown. In this case, Odell would have actually spotted the climbers at the 3rd step, which would be far more consistent with the supposed 5-minute climb. There are various other creative theories regarding Mallory and Irvin, but until further evidence surfaces, a definitive conclusion may never be reached.
Until now.
Fortunately, the mystery is
They
not
did it.
yet a hopeless cause, as the answer to the summit question may lie among the still undiscovered remains of Sandy Irvin. It's highly likely that if either of the 2 climbers reached the summit, they would have collected rock samples. The rocks
Why?
found atop Everest are geologically unique to that part of the mountain. If Irvin were to be found with summit rocks, it would prove that one of the climbers had made it to the top of Everest. Curiously, the 1999 forensic search of Mallory's body neglected to check for summit rocks, so it remains unclear. At the time, the prospect of rock samples had been completely overshadowed by the single most compelling missing piece from the 1924 expedition. As Mallory passed Howard Somerville on his final trek up the mountain, he asked to borrow Somerville's portable Kodak camera to capture photographs in the event of a successful attempt. When Mallory was found in 1999, the camera was not found among his possessions. Therefore, it is likely that Mallory handed off the camera to Irvin sometime during their descent. If the camera is ever located, the undeveloped film within could finally solve the mystery once and for all. Modern-day photographers have shown it's possible to develop 100-year-old film. It's unknown whether the extreme conditions atop Everest would corrupt the process, but in the event that the camera is found, Kodak provided special instructions to give the film its best chance at survival. But before any images can be retrieved, researchers will most likely have to locate the body of Sandy Irvin first. Xu Jing of the 1960 Chinese expedition claimed to have seen a dead climber lying on
Climb
his
it
back
then?
near the
Not worth
first
the
step.
time.
Many researchers
I'll lose
have
internet
inferred that this
internet
must have been
connection, so I won't be able to grind
but subsequent
RuneScape.
searches of the
What's
area
the point?
have thus far turned up nothing. Somewhere high up on the mountain, the missing piece of the Everest discrepancy is waiting to be found. But until that happens, all we have are the theories. There are many arguments for and against a successful summit attempt, but most of them hinge on one unknowable variable: whether George Mallory, while tantalizingly close to his defining achievement, would have chosen to turn back. Away from the mountains, Mallory had a beloved wife and children. After the 1924 expedition, he was known to have aspirations of becoming a writer. He certainly was in no position to throw his life away, nor endanger the life of his young climbing partner. However, the imposing allure of the Everest summit can have a strange effect on people. Many climbers who attempt Everest report a psychological phenomenon known as summit fever, where they become affixed in a trance-like state, compelling them to either reach the summit or die trying. Death was no stranger to George Mallory, who had witnessed the horrors of World War I, an event so
Arcane in 3
traumatizing that
minutes,
it
alright.
profoundly altered the way a generation of men understood the concept of life and death. Many soldiers who lived through the slaughter would go on to develop survivor's guilt, a condition where survivors of a mass tragedy experience sorrow and regret over not perishing alongside their peers. Death was so common in the Great War that many began to see valiant self-sacrifice as an expectation. It's possible that as Mallory was staring down his greatest adversary, he may have been thinking the same way.